Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to this meeting, which in fact is to mark the 100th year of San Giovanni Battista Piamarta, who was made a saint. And this meeting, in fact, goes hand in hand with an exhibition which is called Doing Good Well. Here we have famous people and scholars who will help us today to get to know and understand the reach and importance of the life of this man who, as a young person, encountered Christ and became a fellow player in Brescia at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, developing a surprising number of works in education and vocational training. Now, we're going to, first of all, hear from Cardinal Angelo Amato, who is Prefect of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. Gabriele Archetti, who is a teacher of medieval history at the Catholic University of Sacred Heart, is the author of the great catalogue that illustrates the work of Father Piamarta. And we have Father Enzo Turriceni, who is the Superior General of the Congregation of the Holy Family of Nazareth, is not present here today, but he has sent his presentation, and this will be read by Father Igor Mazzullo, who is the postulator and of the cause. And then we have Professor Alberto Cova, who is a teacher of economic history at the Catholic University of Milan, and Rosino Gibellini, who is the head of the publishing house Editrice Queriniana of Brescia. You might well ask, how come in a meeting dedicated to the human emergency we have an exhibition on a saint? The title of the meeting intends to point up an enormous emergency of the human being in our times. There's a question that could sum it up. In such a difficult moment, uncertainty for the future, how can we live in times like these? How can we live today? You can well understand that you can't answer a question like this with a formulaic answer or an exhortation, because only something real and present, only one person can give the answer and give a suitable answer to this question, this emergency of the human being that Pope Francis talks of and says and underlines is in crisis. Like the crisis of our times, more than the economic, social, political, and institutional crisis, and the crisis of justice, what really is in crisis is man himself. Man is in danger, and this man can only be given hope and positivity by another man, and given the possibility of an opening to the future. For example, it's just like warmth that is communicated and goes from one person to another. These are words of Father Piamarta, and it sums up all the urgency for hope goes from one man to another by way of the testimony that he bears. And when I read the words of Father Piamarta, I thought of another set of words, practically identical. And also, this is enclosed in Lumen Fide, Pope Francis's encyclical. Faith is transmitted in the form of contact from one person to another, like a flame is started from another flame. Because this is what contemporary man needs. This is what the hundreds of young people that Father Piamarta met needed. And today, as then, he didn't offer them an explanation. He didn't offer them a catalogue of instructions to help them in their lives, but he offered the testimony of his own life, of his own person. And I like to recall one of the most moving set of words that another great person from Brescia mentioned, Giovanni Battista Montini, who became Pope Paul VI and who soon will be raised to the rank of blessed. He said, man, in fact, has to listen from masters, because masters of men are people who bear witness. Men of these times are fragile and feel uncertain. They feel anguish and difficulty, and very often they wonder whether they are supported by those his fellow men. And men need to meet other fellow men who irradiate charity, love, joy, despite the trials and tribulations that they have to bear. Being a witness and bearing witness and working in the new fragility, continues Paul VI, doesn't mean alienating man, but it means putting forward pathways of freedom. New generations are hungry for this sincerity, authenticity, and truth. It's understandable, therefore, how they latch on to the people who bear witness to the teachings of Christ. From the little that I have been able to see and read about the life of Father Piamarta in the book and in the exhibition, I think this truly is proof of how he was a witness and how he showed through his work his humanity, and this was due to his encounter with Christ. And now let us immediately start with the presentations of this morning. First of all, I'd like to invite here to give greetings on behalf of the city, the new mayor of Brescia, Emilio Del Bono. He's going to come up to the podium and give us a few words of welcome. It's with great pride and gratitude that I give and extend the greetings on this occasion, the centenary of the death of Saint Piamarta, and also on the occasion of the exhibition that's going to go to Brescia, and I hope it will be seen by many of my fellow citizens, and I look forward to hearing the debate. The figure of Father Piamarta is a very pertinent one for people of Brescia, because it sums up certain great characteristics, cultural, learned scholarship and humble beginnings and great generosity. His roots were popular. Father Piamarta, in fact, was born in one of the most popular areas of Brescia. It's still a very difficult area. It's a neighborhood which is very much lived in, but it is the theater of a considerable amount of social unrest. He was the son of a barber and therefore of a craftsman who really felt the true needs of young people. And this helped him to feel what young people needed at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. He was a very concrete person, but also a very spiritual one, typical of our Brescia fellow men. And what he left behind, his teaching and his publishing house, these were all frequented by thousands and thousands of young people and people from Brescia. And still today, Father Piamarta is, not by chance, a person that is very much in the hearts of my citizens, even if they didn't know about him directly. And then there's also something else which struck me, this ability of his to go out and be a missionary in his own land and in the rest of the world. The school of St. Nazareth, the congregation of St. Nazareth, there are 13 outposts throughout the world. And Brescia today is the headquarters of this congregation. Brescia also has 38,000 registered immigrants, for example, in its city, one of the highest cities, the highest population of immigrants in any city in Italy. And he showed us the way of how we must meet this challenge and how we can make good. And he taught us this. What struck me with his idea that he never said that good people are necessarily weak. Indeed, he said that good people have to be very strong. And in fact, I was very struck by a word in the catalogue. He says, if a good person shows he is fearful and hides away and is shamed that he is good, well, then the evil, bad person will take the forefront and like a rabid dog will take over. A good person has to take the forefront and show that he can bear witness to goodness. And I think that this is all important, especially in our current times. Now, thinking about the title of the exhibition and the title of this meeting, few words came to my mind to introduce this. Don Giovanni wrote these words to his sister at the beginning of 1951. And I think that it's very close to the saying of doing good well. Don Giovanni wrote to his sister, God sees goodness more than he sees the face of the good. And he sung the aria of a great opera, but also man. For man, goodness is always sacrificing oneself for others and sacrificing one's own desires and one's own commodities for others. Each one of us has a great possibility to do good, a profound, tireless sentiment of life as being the possibility for doing good, even if creating good can be a weighty burden, almost like dying. And he ends the letter saying, I hope your life will be that of doing good. And he adds, it's wonderful, Brunhilde, that we can do this in any circumstance that life brings to us. I'd like to give the floor to Cardinal Angelo Amato.
Grazie, Dottor Savorana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Savorana. I'd like to thank you all for being here. Most specifically, I'd like to thank His Eminence, Mr. Simonis, His Excellent Sembiasi. And it is an honor for me and a great pleasure to be here with you at the meeting. This was the first time for me at Rimini and at the Rimini meeting, of course. And I've been greatly struck by the wonderful organization and by the cultural proposals that are offered to the visitors. So what struck me most is the exhibition on the San Giovanni Piamarta and also the exhibition on the martyrs of the Russian church. It is really worth visiting. I'd like to start immediately making a few statements on the subject that has been proposed to me, and I'd like to start off with a personal memory. While getting ready into the tests for middle school, and I'm so old that I used to indeed have to pass tests to be admitted to the middle school. Well, my master, or my teacher rather, would make sure that we in the class would know arithmetics, geography, and he also made us study the four biographies of most distinguished Italian people. So we learned basically the lives and biographies of Alessandro Volta, Giuseppe Garibaldi, Guglielmo Marconi, and Gian Bosco. Please note that Casamassima was the founder of the Socialist Party in my village. The title of the biography of Don Bosco was The Benefactor of Mankind. Benefactor of Mankind. My teacher, indeed, wouldn't hide his admiration for the interest of the Saint from Piedmont in educating young people and in safeguarding the rights of small craftsmen through the first contracts that would protect them. And this is an often forgotten or neglected aspect of Christian sanctity or holiness. That is, its positive and beneficial influence in the social welfare. And whatever is said about Don Bosco can also be said about Father Piamarta and many other saints and blessed that are either known or not as known in our land. There are those who, through charity, knew how to understand and meet the most urgent requirements of their neighbors. San Camillo de Lellis devoted himself to give comforts to the sick, opening together with San Giovanni di Dio, a model hospital that still sets the example for the modern general hospitals. And then Saint Filippo Smaldone devoted his attention to the deaf, and he devoted his life to the education and social promotion of the deaf, founding a congregation of nuns that still carries out this activity successfully throughout the world. And there are some 20 saints that are devoted to that. And then San Giuseppe Benedetto Cotolengo, Saint Luigi Orione, Saint Luigi Guanella are three most important saints of charity that through major physical sufferings and spiritual sufferings have alleviated with the care of the sick, trying to promote the dignity of those people who were either wounded in their body or in their spirits. The Blessed Giacomo Alberione was a bright and dynamic forerunner of the capillary dissemination of Catholic journals within Italian households. There are those who triggered also political schools for the promotion of Catholic Church, amongst whom the servant of God, Don Luigi Sturzo, and obviously we wish all possible good to his followers. Actually, we would have a meeting being fully devoted to Don Luigi Sturzo. I don't know whether you had ever done, because what he achieved was quite extraordinary. He really was something incredible. He was from Sicily, and then the Blessed Giuseppe Tuniolo and the Venerable Giuseppe Lazzati. There are many heroes indeed that bears witness to the generous care for people in jail and even political prisoners. By the way, I'd like to refer also to a nun, the Blessed Enrichetta Alfieri, the angel of San Vittore in Milan, the prison of Milan, that was very much praised and admired during the Second World War by most famous prisoners, such as Mike Bongiorno, who was indeed a political prisoner, and Angelo Montanelli, another political prisoner. And Angelo Montanelli, for example, left us with a very nice description of Enrichetta. Indeed, Nun Enrichetta, Sister Enrichetta, was a wonderful religious woman, most good and brave. I'll always be very grateful to her. All of us would receive different information through her guidance, and she was jeopardizing her own life for us to receive such information. She would give comfort through surreptitious meetings and information, and the gratitude of those who drew benefit from such action is immense. We all remember her rustling dress, and that would raise the admiration that is due to those who are saints and heroes. And this is quite true, because on the one hand we have the heroes of the mainland or motherland, but we also have the saints, or the heroes of the church. Sister Enrichetta ran the risk of being shot by the firing squad of the Nazi for her support to the prisoners. And in the same framework, we should also recall what the Blessed Anna Maria Adorni did for jailed women. The Blessed John Paul II would refer to saints from Piedmont, stating as follows: at all times, the reaction to new and emerging problems and challenges has always been transformed in a new need for holiness to meet again the new challenges. Throughout the rapid changes that occurred in our society over the past 2 centuries, the saints from Piedmont, but we could actually expand that to all other saints and even the saints of Brescia, so the saints of Piedmont reacted with courage, promoting apostolic activities that were open to the emerging issues within the society at large. Don Luigi Giussani stated similar things. Well, these names set the example of a wide network of charity that embraces our people to protect it and support it. It is some kind of an immune system which keeps the body of the Italian society healthy, protecting it from the danger of severe humanitarian deficiencies. Drawing inspiration from the Gospel, the saints have the charisma of caring for their neighbors in need. The needy, as Jesus said, are always going to be with us, as is the case for the poor. I'd like to state right from the beginning that this emphasis on social welfare doesn't turn saints into soulless activists. Quite the opposite, in fact. There are 2 aspects in our saints. One is turned towards the above, towards God, and the other looks down on our neighbors, the neighbors that are there to be loved, protected, educated, and cared for. These aspects are not in contradiction. There's no antithesis between the 2 sides, as is the case for John's Mary, that is contemplative, and her sister Martha, that is very active. In saints, as is the case for the 2 above-mentioned sisters of Lazzaro, the two aspects are complementary and in full harmony. When the holiness of Don Bosco was tested, the promoter of faith, the so-called devil's advocate, put forward a formidable objection. He then said before the Pope, indeed, there was a meeting of the cardinal members to the Sacred Congregation of Rites, and the formidable objection that was raised was as follows. When would Don Bosco pray, as he is constantly busy with an apostolic activity? So when would he find the time to devote himself to prayer, as he was always busy with apostolic activities? And Pope Pius XI, that would chair of the meeting of the cardinal members to the Sacred Congregation of Rites, who had personally met Don Bosco, rejected the objection altogether, stating the question should not be when Don Bosco was praying, but rather when was Don Bosco not praying? Again, the question should be when was Don Bosco not praying? A typical example of the harmonious coexistence of these two sides of the same medal of holiness is something that we can also see with Father Pius, the mystic, the miracle worker, that was a great benefactor of mankind. He has always shown solidarity to the sick, and he devoted the house to relieve suffering to them. So saints belong to our society and have a right to belong to the society. And as Montanelli would say, they are the true heroes of our people. Unfortunately, in history books, they hardly feature, as if to show that the role played by religious men for social welfare is considered as irrelevant. This cannot be considered as negligence, so we cannot indeed neglect the positive action and work of saints. Indeed, saints are the humble makers of a city of man that should be more just and should reflect on earth the glorious city of God. The title of my contribution reads as follows: Men at Work on the Way to Holiness. The Opus Dei in the tradition of the Church is a life of prayer. Indeed, Saint Benedict said nothing should be considered as more important than Opus Dei, i.e. prayer. We know that a motto that was also repeated by Piamarta is Ora et Labora. And this is part of our history books as well, Ora et Labora. So prayer and work make up the two sides of the Benedict holiness and of the Christian sanctity, all in all. This Benedictine holiness had a great impact on European society, so much so that it triggered a high-profile spiritual culture, as well as a civilization based on work that is as noble as the previous one. Italy, that was the motherland of Saint Benedict, drew benefit from this tradition. The Church, indeed, has never been alien to the life of the society at large. In fact, the Church boasts being part of the society at large, boasts its being close on daily life to each individual, supporting challenges or helping through overcome challenges and aiming at the common good. The Church indeed walks hand in hand and within the society. Indeed, it is the true soul of society. Drawing inspiration from the charity of saints, many areas of our society have been improved. Many emergencies have been tackled by saints. I'd like to make a list. Now, I'm not referring to communion liberation because that would take another edition of the meeting. I'd like to quote a few examples based on an investigation that has been carried out by Caritas in Italy and also by Professor Rusconi. The title of his investigation was The Commitment of Italian Church in supporting individuals daily. 6,000
giovani vivono un'esperienza umana altamente formativa al di fuori della scuola e della famiglia. Ricordiamo la canzone azzurra.
6,000 oratories throughout the country where many young people experience or live their important human experience. The oratory is an extraordinary work and is open to all and everybody without any discrimination. This is true in our country. Poor people, rich people, people with education and without any education, people that are Catholic and not, are all welcome to the oratorium. This is the challenge of the Italian Church. The oratory, the best-known model is that of Don Bosco. The oratory is a school of prayer, but also a school of brotherhood, especially through sports, that is very much loved by young people and that can have and that bears with it an important training potential. The oratory is especially devoted to young people, and the church is certainly an agency of the life of charity. It can be very much as the source of the village, disseminating fresh water for all the thirsty travelers. Indeed, the church provides not just service and masses, but also support to the needy. People, churchgoers, still provide money to the church that is given to the poor and in the needy. Caritas identifies hidden poverties that at times find it difficult to emerge. At a time of crisis, Christians are carrying out charity by means of the 3,875 social services, providing primary commodities and providing also school services, canteens, and health support for those most in need. St. Francis of Assisi is the main inspiration from the many canteens where food is served to those in need. And then not only do we have the canteens of the Franciscan orders, but on many other church institutions. In the Caritas office next to the railway station in Rome, in 2011, over 90,000 meals have been prepared. In the hostel nearby, 62,000 people have been hosted overnight, and the medical office has taken care of some 5,000 people. There are some 500 poor people that dine every night at the canteen in Via Marsala in Rome. Most of them are Italian former prisoners or people with mental disease, and other comes from the poor country of Eastern Europe and for North Africa. Caritas has become a true observatory for poverty in Italy. Food Bank is also meeting the requirements of people in need, and it is pretty much disseminated in Italy. We have solidarity funds as well as Catholic churches from nursery school to middle school, and we should also talk about vocational training that draw inspiration from different saints, such as San Girolamo Emiliani, that was a founder of the Somaschi, and San Leonardo Murialdo, the founder of the Giuseppini, and St. John Bosco, with the setting up of the oratory in Valdocco, with the first workshops for shoemakers, tailors, carpenters, and so on, and with the daughters of Maria Ausiliatrice, drawing inspiration from Holy Mary Domenica Mazzarello, teaching young girls to embroider and cook. And other promoters of vocational schools are the Blessed Eugenia Ravasco, San John, Giovanni Battista Piamarta, and Luigi Orioni, Luigi Guanella, and the various feminine congregations that are to be found throughout Italy. These are an important source of charity for the emergence of mankind. Saints has expressed their charity, especially vis-à-vis the ill. Hospitals have been built, rehabilitation centers have been set up, as well as hospice for terminal illnesses have been created and are animated by saints. Study centers and hospitals have been set up, also to support people with disabilities. And San Pio de Pietrelcina with the Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza. In other areas, do we also see the generosity of priests and lay people that becomes true apostles to welcome migrant workers that land to the coasts of Italy? To those, Pope Francis devoted his utmost attention. And then they also fight against drug abuse, mafia. Mafia has killed the martyr, the blessed Pino Pugliesi, that became again a blessed on May the 25th, 2013. The charity of saints is not written on water, it's not written on sand. It is something that is hardwired in the heart of the poor, that remember all the benefits that they've been addressed, and that are willing to become the apostle of charity vis-à-vis their neighbors in need. What I have been referring to is just the tip of the iceberg, which is made of goodness and daily sacrifice of Christians, saints and sinners that devote their energies to promote the health and quality of life of elderly people, the sick and healthy, that are at times alienated or marginalized. Luca Donnelli recently raised an issue with reference to the announcement of the proclamation of the Blessed John XXIII and John Paul II as a saint. How is that saints exist in this era of relativism? And the answer to this question, how come did we have saints at the time of relativism? And he said that the Church is always going to find a new saints at time of faith and at times of lack of faith, because saints bear witness to what God may do with our poor humanity. The saint is a work of God. What is important in saint is God. Saints are truly Opus Dei, the works of God. There's an explosion of energy of good that heals the sick cells of the society. This is why saints are still significant nowadays, because this is why they are still our benefactors. Thank you for your kind attention.
The list of holiness and charity that His Eminence has offered us, and from the flesh and from substance, blood, expressions that Pope Francis cited in his message to the meeting. He mentioned the Renditu Hominis of Pope Benedict. He said that God is of the Church, and there's no other way to have a relationship with the mystery of God than man, with man, other than the sharing, the impassioned sharing of man's life. So we see in this sea of holiness and charity the original contribution, the creative contribution of Father Piamarta. And I'd like to give the floor now to Gabriele Archetti. A priest of humble origins, the apostle of charity and youth, as was defined by Benedict XVI, Giovanni Battista Piamarta is one of the most important personalities of the Brescia Church between the 19th and 20th century. Called Don Bosco Lombardo, he is a giant in education like Lodovico Pavoni, Leonardo Morialdo, Giovanni Bosco, and others. He was able to combine charitable work grafted into securely spiritual origins, and therefore the exhibition Doing Good Well, dedicated to him in the first centenary of his death, is not just a tribute to him, but it explains the general theme, the human being, a state of emergency. Who better than Piamarta to have felt this emergency and find answers, especially with the young people, the most disadvantaged youth, transforming their lives, and in the interest of society, the church, and for the health of their souls? Who better than he was able to fulfill their yearning for the infinity? If we look at Piamarta, his capacity to interpret the needs of the gospel was an ability to use this as an instrument to do good concrete good during his life. This is also the sense of the graphic art, which underpins the exhibition, showing the skyline of his native town, and to really show his holiness. So we are, in fact, encouraged not to find solutions from on high, nor to entrust ourselves to public assistance of yesteryear, but rather to pull up our sleeves and be entrepreneurial and dynamic. Piamarta, in fact, was a man of freedom and a great energy. He was labeled by the anti-Catholic press as being Don Quicksilver. He was born in Brescia, 26th of November 1841. He went to the local oratory and then to the seminary of St. St. Christ for poor clerics. He was ordained in 1865, and for more than 20 years he carried out his apostolate in various parishes, always with concern for young people and those who risked marginalization. In 1886, he founded the Artigianelli Institute and then the Queriniana Publishing House, the Agricultural Colony, and the Religious Congregation for Young Men of the Holy Family of Nazareth. And with the collaboration of Mother Lisa Baldo, he in fact then founded the Female Institute, the Humble Servants of the Lord, 1911. He died in 1913. He, in fact, lived and worked in very difficult periods of industrialization of our country and did his utmost to give young people the tools to create a future for themselves with vocational training, the development of their minds and faith. He also looked to the agricultural world and the need for the peasants to make good. And in the Lombardy area, he developed new production methods and gave peasants theoretical and practical training to be able to make peasants entrepreneurs and restore dignity to working on the land. He met many collaborators who shared the spirit with him and of his work with him and continued his activity. And they say we mustn't stop. Our place is where there are problems and people in need of help. Doing good well is not just one of his greatest exhortations and most frequent exhortations, but it's the very style with which he gave hope to the new generations. His lads saw him as a father, and he said, you can pray while you work. The hoe is in your hand, but your heart is in God. You can work looking to the heavens, because doing your duty well, however small or large, is the way to sanctity. A simple and coherent program was his, and he excluded nobody, whatever their role, social condition, or family background. The exhibition is a history, a didactic history of his life with panels, documents, and video supports. And in the first section, we see his life. But the images and texts which come from the archives represent an innovative way of interpreting the life of Piamarta, founder of the Artigianelli. And this is especially the subject of the second half of the exhibition. It gives a sense of his relationships and substantiated and underlines his unconditional love of the Creator. He doesn't aim to do great things, he says, but to do God's will well and as God wills it. Right from the beginning of his priesthood, Giovanni Battista Piamarta was interested in the life of prayer, and he, in fact, was admired for his dedicated commitment to his priestly duty. His holiness was considered and defined as social because, alongside his educational drive, he was very concerned with the negative effects that socio-economic transformation were causing among the lower classes and youth, as well as the severe damage caused by a population that were flooding into the towns, emigration, uprooting of families, and a moral disruption, as well as the new militant ideas of a political and trade union nature. And therefore he was close also to the less intransigent positions of a group which was facilitated by Pietro Capretti. We're halfway through the 19th century. Therefore he worked with Giuseppe Tovini, Geremia Bonomelli, and Giovanna Maria Longinotti. He, as I say, was one of the least intransigent, but he was not active on the political scene. but he did have attitudes vis-à-vis the social questions. His idea and position, for example, with regard to wages, is an attitude that certainly would sit very well with the current claims of trade unions today. He said, in fact, that a wage can only be considered just if it allows for what he called human bread, worthy of a man. For this bread to be human, he says, this wage must give enough to live healthily, to have a good home, clothes befitting his station, and his family must be made of a wife and two children. And this wage must allow the worker to survive in times of difficulty when he's sick and when he hasn't got a job while he's waiting for another one, and when he is old, not to die in indigence. If a wage does not allow this, it cannot be considered a wage, said Piamarta. The second consideration looks at his educational program, which is summed up in his saying, Pietas et labor. And despite some studies that have been developed, I think it needs further investigation, his educational drive. His practice is only in part original, and it's part and parcel, as His Eminence says. It is part of the training tradition, which goes from Basilio to Benedict and to Francis of Assisi, and also includes Filippo Neri, Ignatius de Loyola, and Francis de Sales. And it consisted in the so-called Salesian preventive method and also vocational training according to Pavoni. And these were two indications that Piamarta took up, and in fact they indicated the idea that he had of restoring the sons of Mary. And in fact, in 1888, Piamarta went to Turin to see how Don Bosco's schools worked, and he received an invitation from Don Michele Rua to unite his work, which was just getting off the ground, with the Salesian educational system. This didn't, in fact, take place. However, it's the monastic example which underpins his educational system, and it's the substrate of his educational system, as the abbot Emanuele Caronti said. He called Piamarta's system the new Benedictine era, system of the modern era. In fact, it was obvious that it was like this because Piamarta was born near the Benedictine monastery of San Faustino, and he loved the stories of the fathers of the desert, and as a young man escaped with a friend to Mount Magdalene to live in a grotto. This didn't last a long time, but this was something which in fact stayed with him. This preventive method, which he got from Don Bosco and also was common to other education experiences, was a very tried and tested system, and it is and has been received by, in the modern age, by the discipline and charisma that it instilled. Young people were constantly monitored during work and for the rest of the day, so that their behavior was constantly monitored and checked with a view to understanding the deep stirrings of the soul and to be able to ensure the physical, psychological, moral, spiritual integrity of the young person. And if you have ever lived in a seminary, you know what I'm talking about. But example took precedence over teaching. There was to be a strict discipline, but also this had to be combined with understanding. And also, a youth must never be idle. Idleness was danger, and An idle mind is tempted by million devils, whereas somebody who is occupied is tempted only by one, Piamarta would say. So his educational system was part and parcel of the teachings of the masters of asceticism. And pias et labor was his interpretation of ora et labora, a life of work and prayer, the pillars for the community life. And he, what was missing was the references to Opus Dei that qualifies and is the basis of monastic life. But all the rest, in fact, echoed monastic life. For example, silent prayer, the thrust and impetus to values, the separation of generations, and so on. But the accent, however, is shifted especially to work. The harsh lessons that are learned in the school of Nazareth. What better way to train and develop the human being than develop good craftsmen and make of them good citizens and good Christians? The example of the Holy Family is not just an example for religious life, but also is an example for young people who are going to go out and have a family and create, and the idea was to create a family within these schools because they often didn't have a family. Piamarta, in fact, talks often of Nazareth. This was a subject he talked of a lot with his young people to teach them the sense of work, sharing and service. The sense of the congregation was element, and the spirit of Nazareth, he says, is a perfect mirror of the Christian family. And he explains it with a metaphor which comes from the world of art. He says there's a great difference between a person who just looks at a painting and somebody who really tries to reproduce that painting. Again, the first way is a superficial gazing at the painting. You look at it a couple of times, you admire its beauty. In the second example, creating the painting again, you almost steal the beautiful and the goodness of the artistic work and you reproduce it. This is the real way in which the holy sacred family must be looked at by the Christian, not only admired for its beauty, but imitated and reproduced. And I think seeing the thousands of young people who are meeting him today, Piamarta today, very often for the first time, Father Piamarta, were he here today, would share many things they have, the educational thrust, the enthusiasm. Indeed, this certainly would have made him very pleased to look at the vocational schools we have today, which are much more technical, but still with the same aim of creating tomorrow's society. Allow me to thank you. This project, Doing Good Well, was born within the congregation during the canonization of Father Piamarta. It was something that the congregation developed, but we are also very thankful to the Lombardy region, the town of Brescia, for this initiative, which in fact was able to avail itself of the collaboration of the Catholic University of Brescia, and also the support of important foundations and companies and associations also gave us their help.
I'd like to thank all the above, and I would also like to thank the meeting that is now playing host of the exhibition on Father Piamarta, Doing Well, Good Well. Well, Father Piamarta would be surprised about the title, The Humanism of Father Piamarta. He wouldn't approve of us making fun of him because these things were important to him. And yet, he knew perfectly well. He had a very clear vision of man. He was indeed deeply rooted in his own city of Brescia. He certainly could boasted a Tridentine faith, and his personal experience was one of a poor orphan. He had a deep knowledge of the saints of the Counter-Reformation. He had close contact with the top characters of the Catholic movement. He was a close friend of Monsignor Geremia Bonamelli, and he had a very true sense of responsibility vis-à-vis the time of his life. Well, when he would say man, Father Piamarta would refer to a man in progress. We could say it in Latin, man inferi, or homo inferi. Basically, he would refer to a man, a young person, to welcome, accompany, support, and guide. There are 5 main roots that can, or 5 main pillars that can help us understand what is the project of humanism of Father Piamarta. So the first important pillar of Father Piamarta was the cult of Brescia. That was a very special land at the borders between Lombardy and Veneto. He has always loved and a pragmatic approach. He's always laid emphasis on action. He always wanted to shift from ideas to facts. He knows that at times what is best can be an enemy of what is good. He holds in great esteem the homo faber, the worker who can make his own future, somebody who can actually build a dignified life for himself, bringing about an enhancement also for the society at large. Piamarta has an insight on the problems, he studies that, he talks about them, and he's also very impatient for finding a solution. The question is not just what to do. Next to the what to do question, there's another question that adds to it, and that is how to do it. Indeed, he had a very active take on life, a very responsible approach. Then he also had a great pillar in his personality, as he drew importantly from his personal experience as a poor orphan. He was abandoned to himself as a young boy, and he knows that young orphans can be victims to wicked adults. He tried to benedict the oratorium. He said, I would have been really nobody unless I had without the oratorium. So he saw 2 possibilities. He could walk the way to vice and that to holiness. He could opt to become a monster, or rather a person worth of praise. And he wanted to try and have as many young people walking the way to holiness and wisdom. Piamarta had a dramatic vision of mankind. He indeed understands that man is capable of all wickedness, but at the same time, man is also capable of heroism. He talked about Brescia, referring to it as a corrupted city. At the same time, he would say that there was another half of Brescia that would be worthy of praise. He was not playing down on evil, but he understood that what was good was worthy of being held in high esteem. He knows that words are to be accompanied by facts. So his humanism was dramatic but creative at the same time. We could look also at his faith as based on Tridentine faith. The Council of Trento has reacted to the pessimisms of reformers, triggering good works for the Christian, and the clergy of Brescia was considered as very full Tridentine faith, healthier after Bishop Bollani, better educated after Bishop Querini, and more committed to the pastoral after the example of Saint Charles Borromeo. Piamarta has a sound faith. He knows that faith without works, without actions, is dead. He knows that he has a task that cannot be trusted with anybody else. He knows that he is going to be held responsible for what he has to do for his neighbor. And he knows that without faith, the works of faith do not hold for truth for long. He's also a Tridentine priest, as he believes that the holiness of the people depends on the holiness of the clergy. He wrote in the sad times for church and society, the first step to reanimate in the Christian life, it requires the reformation of the clergy. This is why he puts together a group of people to find a new spirit so that they can bring about the divine mission to the moral and the material advantage of the poor and the young. He really started his congregation to find a home to these young poor. So he had a humanism that was for the church and for the community. The church should be very much the home of the poor man and of the abandoned man. Then he also drew inspiration from the saints of the Catholic Reformation. He read a lot of biographies of saints, and he was very much focused on the reconstructors. He was most focused, for example, on Saint Ignatius from Loyola. He was a master of the humanism of embodiment. He was very much preoccupied with meeting up with God on a daily basis, as if everything depends on what we do, and God should only witness the results of our work. And then St. Francis of Sales, he was the teacher of the pious humanism. Love indeed is the top and the perfection of mankind. Everything should be guided towards God. And Saint Teresa was fascinating him was with her humanism, based on Christ. He would refer to an inner castle that should give strength, and he strongly adhered to what God would say. Without me, you can't do anything. The Piamarta is in close contact with the Catholic movements, Giuseppe Montini, Giuseppe Tevini, the Bishop of Cremona, Geremia Bonamelli, the Bishop of Brescia, Giacomo Corna Pellegrini. All people were extremely sensitive and aiming at the development of a Christian society. At times they would use different strategies. At times such strategies would be ones across the against the other. And Piamarta would repeat, in dubis libertas, in necessarius unitas, in omnibus caritas. I think that I don't need to translate that for you, do I? So humanism of charity, humanism accepting conflict, but what is even most important is that such conflict should find a solution, so as to safeguard the primacy of charity. The charismatic synthesis of San John Battista Piamarta guides everything towards the making and the growth of a human person, of a man, acknowledging the gifts he or she was given, using such to develop something which is worthy of God, trying to develop his or her own family for a society that should be more based on the brotherhood and more Christian. personal commitment to religious dimension, pietas and labor, almost eternus as a support and as an aim of the Homo Viat, a silent and eloquent lecture of a Christian humanism for our own times. Father Piamarta should help us in raising people that can develop a home for ever. Thank you.
Professor Cova.
Grazie.
Thank you. I have to go back to the theme that comes from the image of His Eminence when he talked about a saint that looked downwards. And what does he see? What does Piamarta see? He saw the condition of youth. This has been repeated by the other speakers, by Archetti and by the father. He looked at the condition of youth, and he has to give an answer in terms of vocational training and education to the youth he saw. And this education and vocational training, education is especially directed to areas where there is really a possibility of finding a job afterwards. Craftsmanship and a small town-based or city-based production, and also work in the rural areas. I'll go back to this later. My presentation will try to understand the significance of Piamarta's action, his concept of work, and also his concept of work which can be seen over and above the conception and the concept of Piamarta, and which can be understood by looking at things from a historical point of view, seeing what he actually did and comparing these things with the overall complex project of his work and its role within its context. So this is how I'm going to approach it. Now, starting from the reasons, very shortly described, the reasons behind Saint Piamarta's sanctification, his experience in parishes of the countryside and town, and these two aspects are quite important. He became, in his pastoral work, fully aware of the condition of the working class and also the condition of young people. And this 19th century in Brescia was a period in the history of Italy and Brescia in which the congregations, the new congregations that look down and try and find answers to the situation they saw, well, the number of these congregations were 200. There were 49 of these new congregations in Lombardy alone, according to studies looking into this period of the 19th century. And the works of these associations and congregations was all important. And they were the vehicle for the ideas of people who want to do things, people who had ideas, and it offered a way of the Catholic world linking into the social world. And it's not from a political point of view, it was a local, more territorial sort of attitude and association, which then was extended further, but started in a very local way. It was homed in on the local area, and it looked especially to social works, cooperation, and other sorts of activities. And the works, I beg your pardon, of the congregations were all important. When in '86 he was told, well, look after the problem of young people's work, certainly Piamarta's attention would have been to the specific situation, the economic difficulties, and also the situation in which the congregations were doing a great deal at that time to try and alleviate the difficulties. And this then again led to political participation. Work at that time was to a certain extent dictated. What was thought that could be the work solutions for young people in difficulty is the sort of work that could be trained for, and also it was very apt to Italy of the time. Italy of that time had certain areas in the north that were undergoing transformation, and there was an agricultural crisis, but industrialization was starting to pick up. So thinking of what young people could do in terms of craft activities and craft skills was something that was very pertinent to the times and was seen as a possible answer to young people who had to be given prospects of overcoming their situation. But the economic transformations of the time required an ability to know how to go about this, and as well as understanding what one was about. And therefore, professional schools, vocational training, had to be accompanied by understanding both of the situation and also of the how-to of this vocational training. Because, of course, this craft training, vocational training, was very practical, but also theoretical. Remedello is an example of this. Remedello School is an example of bringing practice and theory together. And the Father Piamarta, for example, explained new farming practices theoretically, and then learned how to apply the new farming practices in their rural situation. So here we have this essential connection. We continue to repeat this need today to have training of this kind, theoretical training that must be accompanied by practical training. And then there's another fundamental issue with regard to Piamarta and what he did. I don't know whether Piamarta was absolutely fully aware of this or conscious of it, but what comes out studying his initiatives is that the response that he tried to give in terms of work for young people who were trying to overcome difficult situations, the response given was not just seen as a job just to be able to earn a wage or to get a good wage. I mean, even if he talked about a just wage, and that was very important, here we have a concept of work which restores the dignity of the person, and that's the fundamental understanding that Piamarta had. We know the significance of work full well today. It's the forerunner of personal freedom, and it's the enhancement of people's ability and skills, and it allows people to fulfill their life projects. It's a fundamental complex understanding of work. It's not just a practical thing. It even goes to having a religious dimension, the whole question of work and having a job. And therefore, for Piamarta, we have the integration of vocational training, civil training, civic training, and religious training. There were these three components which could not be separated one from the other. And they are deliberately linked and inextricably linked. And indeed, his community strengthened the three components and brought them closer together in its developing the idea of a family, a community. And this is a conception of work which, in my view, is correct, because the religious side is all important, and it's not sufficiently underlined, as Father Mazzilli said. But this also involves a vision of life and of work as having this more spiritual, more religious side. And today, of course, we think immediately of a beautiful passage of a encyclical. In the word of the divine revelation, it is written that there is this fundamental truth that man, made in the image of God, through work participates in the work of the Creator, and supporting the toil of work in unity with the crucified Christ, collaborates with the Son of God to the redemption of the human being. This is 1981. Encyclical of 1981. Piamarta was talking about this 70 years earlier. But this positive conception of work, and not just a toil for one's original sin, this particular concept of Piamarta is all important, and it links in with this encyclica as well. It is work seen as an imitation of the work done by God the Almighty. And this was a very current thought during Piamarta's time. And in 1908, a famous scholar wrote this exactly in Social Economy. Man, the working man, it was generally thought, the very concept of work has this element in it. It functions as man being creative in the image of God. Now, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, with the dominant idea of work coming more and more to the fore, we see a different idea of work. Pope Leo, when he talks about the condition of work, mentions the main concept of work, which would come from the other side of the Atlantic. And we see the change of the idea of the function of a man. But still we have this basis of work as being the means with which work could help man to be reborn. And this was before work changed its concept and people thought of work in a different way. Now, the action of Piamarta is part of an overall design of changing the economic order, which was seen in the Catholic movement, not just in the Italian Catholic movement, but in the Belgian, German, French Catholic movement at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century. This idea of a new economic order was very much to the fore at that time, but it wasn't able to hold sway because it didn't have wasn't sustained by any roots. But again, this was taken up again by lay ideas, the need for a new economic order, and the economy which showed the working classes to be so hard put. And this new economic order had to be based on two inextricable themes, economic laws and economic justice. And this was the basis, or would be the basis, for a new economic order without having to go to the extremes of Marxist revolution. And as the Germans would say in the 1930s, this opened the way to anarchy, the revolution. And this new economic order was seen as being based on social justice and social economic change. With the change in the legal instruments and the developing of associations, these are parts of the answers which are put forward to promote this new economic order, to be able to give life to it. Now, I've summed up things very quickly: cooperation, social legislation, and trade unions. These are, if you like to put it in a slogan, the synthesis of what this new economic order was based on. So the proposal that was made in these years, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and I accept, and I think we have to see these years as being the essential backdrop to Piamarta's work. But it shows how this proposal of renewal is not, as has been said by historians, which I think have not been very attentive to the sources, it's not a response in terms of re-proposing economic orders of the Ancien Regime or the medieval feudal system. These ideas don't propose a return to the Middle Ages. On the contrary, they propose change compatible with the technological changes ongoing at that time, which can't, to a great extent, be changed or stopped. So the new trade and the new economic system would have to be accompanied by new skills, and this would be the only way to offset social disequilibria and social conflict. This was the idea of Piamarta. When Piamarta got his pupils to study agricultural practices, it was to strengthen entrepreneurs, peasant entrepreneurs, and to try and overcome the system of crop sharing, for example, and to increase agricultural production and therefore increase revenues, and introduce thereby a new system which did not go back to the Middle Ages, but which developed a new system, but without going against the new tendencies and trends. And this is exactly what Piamarta did. When he got his pupils to study industrial skills at the Artigianelli school, he prepares, in fact, people to work in the large companies, but he also forms and trains people to become small-time craftsmen. And he thereby gives new life to a production structure that was thought to be overcome and made obsolete by the Industrial Revolution, but was not obsolete at all, was very much compatible with the new production system. So our Giovanni Battista Piamarta, in my opinion, is somebody who contributed to this proposal for change, not for going backwards, but for substantive change in his response to trying to solve the problems of the society that he saw among the youth, but also not necessarily of youth. And he places at the center of his educational system the person and the giving value to the person. This is my interpretation. Of course, it's a personal interpretation of the work and the initiatives of Saint Giovanni Battista Piamarta in the social field. Thank you. Now I'd like to give the floor to Rosino Gibellini for the last presentation. The Editrice Queriniana takes its name, publishing house takes its name from Angelo Maria Guerini. I'd just like to talk a little bit about Querini, who has already been nominated. Now, Querini was born in Venice in 1680, and he was the scion of a noble Venetian family. He became part of the Benedictine order in Florence. He studied Hebrew and Greek. He traveled widely in Europe, searching for ancient manuscripts, and he met important personages of the era like Newton, Fénelon, Malebranche. Querini, who was the Bishop of Corfu and then later of Brescia for 30 years. He was a cardinal and the prefect of the Vatican Library with the very onerous task. He complained of having to live in the diocese of Brescia, where he died at 75 in 1755. He was an ecumenical person before his time, and he worked hard to develop relations between Christian churches of the East and West. But it's interesting to recall this episode. Just a few years before his death, on the occasion of the Jubilee of 1750, in 1748 in fact, he sent a letter to Pope Benedict XIV, in which he asked to reduce the rigors of the post-Tridentine confessional practice in view of the preaching of pardon inspired by the Gospels, and he pleaded for a rapprochement with the Protestantism. This proposal was rejected by Benedict XIV. And during his episcopate in 1745, he founded the Civic Querinian Library of Brescia. So Querini remained a symbol of culture, of being a patron of the arts and culture. He was a cosmopolitan. He was an open Catholic. More than a century after his death in 1884, a printing house was opened in Brescia, which was called Tipografia Queriniana, the Queriniana Publishing House, as a tribute to the great Bishop of Brescia, when the board of the Citizen of Brescia, the Catholic daily directed by Giorgio Montini, father of the future Paul VI, he decided to print his own newspaper. 2 years afterwards, in 1886, the printing house Queriniana was joined together with the Institute Artigianale and was entrusted to Father Giovanni Piamarta. In 1986, the printing house was considered as the date of its founding. This was the only Catholic printing house of Brescia and was an organ of the local Catholic press. It printed newspapers, magazines, but also books of pastoral teachings. And this was the only printing house at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. It was Piamarta who transformed this printing house into a publishing house. And in fact, this has been documented by the Brescia historian Luigi Fossati. In the decades after that, up to the 1950s, the publishing house Queriniana printed a catalogue of pastoral books especially, but also they started to translate into Italian European authors like Garrigan, Lagrange, Thomas Synthesis, Sertilange, Catholic Life, Danny Leroux, Holy Pagans, Karl Rahner's You Are Silence, and also the Russian Jesuit Ivan Kologrigov was translated into Italian. With the indication, the preparation, the celebration of the Second Vatican Council in the very intense 7 years of 1959 to 1965, the cultural and spiritual climate of the Catholic Church changed dramatically, and this change also saw great transformations in the publishing of the Catholic press. The first sign I saw in the Italian publishing houses was the publishing of Karl Barth's The Epistle to the Romans by Feltrinelli of Milan in November 1962, at the beginning of the first session of the Council. The work had waited for 40 years to be published in Italian. Now, with this publication, we saw, in fact, a change of mentality also in the readers of these texts. But this was only the beginning of the surprises. In 1963, in Brescia, we saw the first publication of Kittel, the great lexicon of the New Testament. This was published in Italian in January 1965. While the council was still ongoing, the Queriniana publishing house started its publication of the International Review of Theology, Concilium, now still edited and published in 7 languages and directed by Conga, Rana, Künger, Metz, and Schillebeck. In the historical editorial of the first edition of the magazine, Rana and Schillebeck wrote, compared to the enormous task of the church in every country, every nation is theologically underdeveloped, they wrote. In this magazine and in this review, the theology of each country intends to help the other nations to develop. After more than 40 years of activity, there was a change, and it was decided in the General Assembly of the Concilium that was held in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Münster in Germany in the first week of June of 2007. It was decided to transfer the seat of the presidency and secretariat of the review. The network of theologians was in 5 continents. It was decided to shift this from the Catholic University of Nimega in the Low Countries to the Asian Center of Intercultural Studies of Madras, India. with linking in with the Institute of Missiology of Aachen, with the Loyola University in Chicago, and with ramifications to other universities and cultural institutions to be able to enhance the international character of the review. And Conca defines the Concilium as a radar which is exploring the signs of the time. So, and in 1965, in fact, the Italian version was developed. In 1966, we saw the publication of the series, the Giornale di Teologia, the Journal of Theology. And then after 1969, we saw the start of the Library of Contemporary Theology with the publication of great theological works. In these two series, you can find, in part at least, the journey taken by contemporary theology. But also, the Queriniani published Protestant works as well, like Barth, Müffer, Bultmann, Moltmann, the Greek Yanaras, and published these not just because they are Protestant, but because they're great authors that ask themselves questions. They come from their own traditions, but they ask themselves what Christianity is, what the future of Christianity is. Barth, for example, writes pages that are very profound on the word of Christ, or Van Hofer, for example, who died in Flossenburg concentration camp a few weeks before the end of the war, and he was part of the resistance. He asked himself about the future of Christianity in a secular state. And we need other texts that ask themselves with what will happen to Christianity, not only in a secular state, but in a pluralist state and city, where we have these pluralist societies which are now coming to the fore. And we have to have these theological publications because they very often have not been published. So all these publications took place and were done, and now they are part of the curricula of many faculties of theology, and therefore the network of theology has in fact been widened, and every large town in Italy has its own facility and prepares children and young people to teach Catholicism and Christianity in schools. And these books come to the university as well, even if there's not a faculty of theology. In Italy, we have the history of Christianity, history of religions. There is philosophy of religions, which exists as a subject, sociology of religions, which exists as a subject, psychology of religion. Here there are so many courses on religion, on Christianity, and these books, which are published, are now part of the university's works. They have now become part and parcel of universities and cultural centers in Italy because they, in fact, propose and argument and articulate a Christian message, and also within the context of universal religions. These works have now entered many libraries throughout the world. And they also are very much used because Italian certainly is an accessible language for those who study theology, and they have become very widespread, especially in Rome. Now, with these three initiatives between 1965 and 1969, we see the axis of theological publication, which is still very much alive. In the 1970s, the publishing house Queriniana published the Italian edition of the biblical commentary of St. Geronimus, and with under the title the Grande Commentario Biblico, and the presentation also by Carlo Maria Martini. And in this way, the Queriniana enters the world of biblical scientific inquiry. I'd like to mention the historical studies as well. In the 1980s, the Queriniana published the ecumenical history of the Church in 3 volumes. It's an expression of the history of the Church in German, and the preface was written by the Giuseppe Alberigo, and he underlined the novelty of this historiographic enterprise, where Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox historians reconstructed the journey of the Church that has lasted 2,000 years, and also being very attentive to the history of theology. This Bolognese historian says the ecumenical history of the Church, in fact, shows the qualitative aging of the ecclesiastic stories, because it widens it out to many other sectors. The work was very well received, and after 30 years, a new edition of this was published. And the editors say an ecumenical history of the Church cannot attempt to harmonize everything. It has to simply give a contribution to a better understanding of diversity, and not bring a solution to the contrasts which exist within Christianity. Only a sober historical reconstruction developed by several voices can in fact show the fundamental common features of the Christian confessions, but also underline the historic conditions that led to this, and the historical reasons for divisions. I'm not going to go into the contribution of the Italian scholars to this volume. However, let me conclude. The most recent series is also called Books, and it is for a general public. And it has started by reproposing the 13th edition. Now it's already at the 19th edition, but it proposed a re-edition of the introduction to Christianity by the theologian Joseph Ratzinger, which was published originally in German in 1968 and then published in Italian in 1969. And the 19th edition, as I say, of this work has now been published, and Pope Ratzinger received a copy immediately, of course. He was in his palace in Castel Gandolfo in that week when he was at Castel Gandolfo, and he sent us a very moving letter. He is was very moved by this 19th edition of his publication Introduction to Christianity, published way back in 1969 in the Italian edition. And he underlined how very many good thoughts this in fact triggered, and it gave him great comfort. The ancient and very small printing house, which was taken up by Father Piamarta at the end of the 19th century as a means of teaching young people at his Artigianelli Institute, to teaching them printing, in fact has gone a long way and developed enormously in the service of the spreading of the Christian thought, and to do this at an international level. Now, we have seen what wealth of goodness a man can do if a man, in fact, gives himself up to Christian life, and who wants to meet the challenges of his time that Pope Francis has summed up again in his message to the meeting: the urgency of returning man to himself, to his great dignity, to the precious nature of every human existence. This is the task of every Christian, to serve man by trying to seek him out, even in the spiritual and social meanders which are most hidden. The greatest poverty is the lack of Christ, and until we bring Jesus to man, we will always have done too little for them. Now, the Christian declaration announcement on Giovanni said is the announcement of a new man that we are called upon to become, and becoming this with others, we can change the earth. This has already started to change and will change completely when God so wills, when the history of and the story of Christ will be accomplished. I think that this is the great testimony that San Piamarta offers us today to help us on our way and to help us do our Christian duty. Thank you all.